Hi, it's Shane Rushton again. I wanted to do another tutorial here involving formatting, because formatting, when you're creating tools in Excel, is a pretty powerful tool, and I don't think many people take advantage of it to the full extent of what formatting can do. I mean, you find a lot of people within companies who are afraid to change, or they're not really comfortable with building things, or most of the time I just find people are really quite set in their ways and they don't need change, and they think that the way they've always done it is fine, and it might even be cathartic to some people. So getting them to change over may be difficult. So a lot of times I just build tools for myself, and then when people realize that I'm doing the same work in a quarter of the time that they're doing it, they start generating some interest, and they go, "What are you doing?" So most of the time what I do is I try to get them to learn this so that I don't have to do it for them. But because most people won't and can't, I've created quite a niche at work as being sort of the Excel guy people come to. So I am doing kind of a series, I think, of videos on teaching Excel stuff. I'm going to be focusing on avoiding these. And these are form controls and ActiveX controls. Now, form controls and ActiveX controls consist of a variety of things. There's checkboxes, there's labels, there's frames, which group a bunch of inputs together. There are buttons, there's radio buttons, there's combo boxes, and combo boxes are used to be basically drop downs. There's images, you can put images in there, you can put subforms. I don't like these forms because a lot of times I find when I'm at work, if I'm working on something and I have one of these in there, if I undock my laptop and then I come back over and click on that again, it starts to grow and grow and grow, and I hate it. And I don't like any of the features that are in here, because my coding is advanced to the fact that it's past the point where I don't need any of this stuff. Because buttons have built-in click functionality that when you go into the VBA, you can, pretty much make a macro do what you want it to do without a lot of training. And combo boxes have their own inputs and different effects that can occur based on when you select it. But once you really dive into code, you don't need to rely on any of these if you want to use cells. So the way that I do that is I focus on formatting first, and I always start by highlighting a huge ton of these columns. And I right click and set the column length to 2.25. And you'll notice right off the bat, you'll see kind of a graph paper effect is what it looks like. And I like that. Now most of the time, I'm building my tools to be centered inside the document right here in Excel, so that they're not shoved up against the edge there. It gives it kind of it doesn't feel crowded to me. So once I've done these columns into 2.25 width, I now have a lot more functionality available to me for formatting. So I may like to start with the gray, because most people are used to seeing that color in their programming, in the programs that they use. Put a border around it, kind of gives it this is the area. And then always start my inputs at least one cell in, so that I have kind of an edge. And so here's why I do the formatting. I make tools where there's a lot of data entry, and it might generate forms to be printed, or emails to be sent, or it might generate some comments that might go into an account if you're a customer service representative and you're taking calls that oftentimes are very similar, and the notes end up being quite similar, with the differences being obvious, like the name and the number and account number and whatnot, and maybe the resolution. But ultimately, the bulk of the call is the same. They're calling in because they have a complaint about something, or they're calling in for a discount, or they're calling in because they saw somebody in your company doing something stupid. There's a lot of reasons that people call, but many times I find in all the call centers that I've worked at in the past, that call types end up being kind of similar. So I've generated several commenting templates that would allow me to sort of add a few features, maybe copy and paste from an account, or type it in there if need be, and use some checkboxes and drop downs to generate different notes that occur, and to generate different events that occur during that call, so that a comment would be really super simple and a few clicks away, but it would be very detailed and would match what happened, all without having to type it out by hand every time I get a call, which can create typos and maybe people aren't quite understanding what you're doing. So if you have a template, everybody kind of does the same exact thing, so you can expect to see a certain result, and your employer definitely wants to see that, and it's easier for maybe data extraction if they expect certain words that they're looking for. But ultimately, formatting is where it's at. And so start with your column widths, because when you do that, now you have a lot of flexibility when it comes to making inputs for any tool that you're building. So if you have somebody's name, that's a pretty common one you might want to have. You might also want to have their account number. So you can make another box. And by doing this, what I'm doing is I'm merging these cells together to make from squares to rectangles. And then adding borders and then fill color to make it look white. One of the things that you may want to do if you're creating an input to make it a lot more like what you expect to see in the real world, I like a solid border, but you don't have to do that. You can take a dark border and put that around the top and the left, and then take a lighter border and do the bottom and the right, and you end up having kind of a sunken effect. It might be a little bit better to do a little darker gray on the outside, because it still looks sunken, but you can get deeper if you make bigger borders. If you were to come in here and use maybe a bolder border, you might get a little bit more sunken effect. If you were to change this color out here to a little darker gray, you'd see a little bit more. But as you can see there, that looks fairly sunken in. So if you're trying to go for that look, you can do it that way. But another thing about formatting is that sometimes the input that you have is Boolean, where it might be yes or no. And there's another tutorial that I put up about making checkboxes. But when you do your columns like this, you can make checkboxes. You can also make them look sunken, the same way that you would make the other one look sunken, by using a dark border on the top and the left, and a light border on the right and the bottom. Pretty straightforward. And if you do that, I would advise to sort of separate that by a row, and maybe make your row kind of narrow so that you have a definite separation. But I would go as far as to make that, find that sweet spot to where you can separate your two elements and make it look definitely separated. So now that you've seen that, if we were to make that functionality work as a checkbox, that would look like a checkbox, and yet you still have an input here, as opposed to what most people do, is they just widen each one to make their input proper for name, account number, and so on. And when that happens, you can't put checkboxes in here because you can't change these to squares. So that's why I always start with my graph paper look by setting the column width to 2.25. So those are just some formatting effects that you can get for inputs. This is the one I prefer. It looks classy. It's pretty standard these days. Now, once upon a time, the sunken effect was a big deal. But it's still possible, and there it is, right there. That's how I do it. I like to clear things out. Another thing about formatting, if you format a cell and you like it, but it's in the wrong spot, the best thing to do is get this cursor, put it over the edge, get that cursor, and you can drag that anywhere. If it is a merged cell, you're always going to want to make sure you're not dragging it to another merged cell, because you can't. But you can drag this around all day and put it wherever you want to put it. So that's one other thing about formatting that I find important, that if you need to drag something around, that's how you do it, and that's the best way to do it. Another thing that I like to do to avoid these guys, in-cell dropdowns, those are pretty easy. I tend to use lists on another sheet and then reference those lists in my data. If you don't know how to do that, make a comment or send me a message, and I'll put up a tutorial about that as well. But dropdowns are pretty simple. You can just do that in-cell dropdown. You don't have to use external lists. You can do it right here. And it can be anything you want. You just got to separate them by a comma. Now you have a drop down that never grows bigger and smaller. It's always there. Be careful when doing these. If you resize them, you see that now that the drop down, that little button goes away. So if you're ever do that, sometimes it's too small, so be careful of that. But other than that, that's a cool, great way to make a drop down. And because you're in control of that drop down, again, if you want to make that look sunken, you can do that anytime you want to on the drop down. It's no problem. Just upper left, or left and right, top and left, sorry, or dark, bottom left, bottom and right are light. So there's your drop down in the sunken zone. Another thing that these offer are radio buttons. Use my tutorial for the checkboxes as radio buttons. It's way better than using these guys. But there's other things that are very powerful, these buttons. So with a button, I admit it is a lot easier, but they still do the grow thing where you're using it and then they get bigger and bigger. So what I have changed my process to is to create buttons by merging my cell. I'm taking 4 columns wide, 2 rows tall, and I'm going to right click in there. I'm going to click format. I'm going to do this fill, and I'm going to use fill effects, and I'm going to set my color 2 to a darkish gray, and this right here is what my button is going to look like right down here. I can make it look beveled in the middle, or beveled from edge to edge, or even reverse it. I prefer this first one. And then I don't put a border on it, just around it, just a straight border. Again, sunken, if you want to make it look sunken, or raised or whatever. I think you can reverse the left and the right thing, and you get a button that looks raised. But if you take that border out and just put a straight solid border, I think it looks better. And then you just put whatever you want to put in here. So the reset button, it's going to reset. Then you can either rename it here. I like to rename mine button _name. And that way, not name would be whatever you want to put in there. But if I name a button this, then I can trigger my my code to operate off of these 3 characters with the underscore. But that's how I make my buttons, so that I can bypass format controls. And then, of course, drop downs. So those are the ways that I avoid at all costs, if I can, the ActiveX and form controls. Because this button will never grow, no matter how much you undock your laptop. This will never grow. It'll always stay the same. And it works. And it's very reliable. Easy to do. Again, you can just drag these around if you don't like where they're at. Just drag them around and then clean up your area where you left them. And they become very useful. Again, I was talking about formatting. If you don't drag that to a new location and you're still trying to set it over where cells are already merged, you'll get an error. So if you have to drag it over 2 cells like that, then you can simply just drag it to another location and back. You don't have to start reformatting everything. And the best part about dragging that is you see the name still follows it when you do it that way. So instead of reformatting other cells to look like it, if you just drag that around until it fits where you want it, you won't lose your name. And if you've already got code associated with it, the code will still trigger. So that's how I do it. I can't think of any other element right off the top of my head that I would format, because that's pretty much all I need to replace the ActiveX controls. But I'll do a tutorial on a hide and unhide button for some rows that I've done recently. It's pretty neat. That kind of allows you to limit the amount of inputs that you have to deal with, but at the same time allows you to add more if you need more and subtract them if you don't. That's a fun tutorial that I'll use VBA code for. But we can go over reset buttons as well, or just triggering buttons with limited amounts of code, and then hiding cells for different sections. I might put up a tutorial on how to do a quick commenting template next, so look for that. And if you have any other kinds of tutorials you want to see, let me know. And again, thanks for watching.